Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson analyzes USDA reports on grain stocks and planting acres. Bob Klein describes severe injury and winter kill in southwestern Nebraska wheat. Sheila Purdum explains biosecurity measures poultry producers can take against the H5N2 Avian Flu. And Ron Plain recaps the USDA's quarterly hogs and pigs report. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our market analyst this week. On Tuesday, the USDA released reports on quarterly grain stocks and prospective plantings. The agency totaled corn stocks in all positions on March 1st at more than 7.7 billion bushels, up 11% from a year ago. It tallied soybean stocks at more than 1.3 billion bushels, 34% higher than last year. The USDA believes growers will plant 2% less corn at 89.2 million acres and increase soybean acres by 1% to a record 84.6 million acres. Nebraska is estimated to plant 9.3 million acres of corn, the same as 2014 and the third highest in the country. However, the state is projected to have the largest drop in the nation in soybean area, falling 300,000 acres to 5.1 million, and a tie with Ohio as the 8th largest grower. We talked with Frayne Wednesday afternoon and asked first for his thoughts on the grain stocks estimates.
Well, the one number that I think the trade focused on the most was the corn stocks number. That's usually the hardest one to track. On the soybean and the wheat side, we have intermediate reports that we can use to track things fairly closely, but the corn one is very difficult just because the livestock sector and the feed usage is such a big component of that number. So we use these quarterly stocks report as a gauge for how quickly are we using up corn within the feed business. And it looks right now, based on the numbers, the quarterly stocks report came out a little bit bigger than what the trade was expecting. That suggests we may not be feeding quite as much corn into the livestock sector as we had originally thought. One of the things we will have to watch as we move into April and the April WASDE report is, will USDA adjust that feeding number as we move forward?
What are your overall thoughts on the number of acres that the USDA put out this week?
Well, of course, that was a report that everybody was really focused on, and in particular on the soybean numbers. If you looked at kind of the pre-trade estimates, the range in the corn number was relatively tight, the range in the wheat number was relatively tight, but there was a wide range in the soybean number, and that's kind of what everybody was watching. But that ended up to be kind of the number that came the closest. So the average trade estimate on the soybean was very close to what the USDA report said. Actually a little bit positive. We're going to have more soybeans next year, but not quite as much as what the trade had expected. On the corn side, we know we're going to have a cutback in corn acres. That cutback wasn't quite as strong as we had expected, so the combination of a little bit more ending stocks and a little bit more acres was really what put the downward pressure on corn. On the wheat side, there were very small adjustments in the winter wheat seedings number. Most of the wheat numbers, or the interest in the wheat sector, was in the spring wheat and the durum numbers. And again, they came out very close to what the trade was expecting.
Well, we talked before about where these acres could possibly go and specifically what would go to soybeans. Nebraska takes the biggest hit, going down 300,000 acres, but North Dakota, which would be the 4th largest planter this year, goes down 100,000 acres. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and that was a surprise to me, because as I talk to farmers, as I've traveled during the winter meeting season now, my expectation was that we were going to have an increase in soybean acres in North Dakota, and I still think that's very likely. I think part of the difference between what the report said and what I'm hearing out in the country is a little bit has to do with the survey methodology that USDA uses. I'm not sure that they're surveying those northern and western growers, the new growers of the corn and soybean belt in North Dakota. I don't know that they're surveying those folks as deeply as much as they should. And again, that will be our transition zone. That's where all our acres will be flipping around. So I would not be surprised that by the time we get into final planting season and we get the final numbers that North Dakota soybeans are up. On the Nebraska side, again, you know, these Central Plains states are the transition zone. When the world needs more one crop or another, we tend to be the ones that make those adjustments. So again, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Nebraska as well.
Based on where the adjustment is for corn and soybean acres across the multiple state region, do you think that could change as we get forward into actual planting season?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that, again, I was looking for was where are the shifts? Can we get some general patterns for the shifting of acres? And on the corn side, we did see the central and eastern corn belt those states have most of the reduction, and then the western corn belt being fairly neutral to, you know, about even where they were last year. And on the soybean side, it was the exact opposite. Most of the big increases in soybean acres came in the central and in particular the eastern corn belt, with those western corn belt states having a slight decrease. And so as we go through spring's work, knowing that the western corn belt's a bit on the dry side and the eastern corn belt's pretty wet and wet last fall, had a lot of rain this summer. It looks like we're getting some more rain showers this spring. There's concerns about, you know, what kind of planting progress we'll have. Will these acreage shifts or people adjust their planting intentions if it does get to be a very wet, drawn-out spring, especially in the eastern corn belt? And then again, on the western corn belt, are we going to get some rains, or is this is some of the drought that we're seeing in the southern plains, is that will continue to spread into the western regions? Again, from a market dynamic standpoint, these will be things we're watching.
Now, I know a few weeks ago when we talked, you were very bearish in soybeans. After the report, does that hold?
I still am. I'm not quite as bearish as I was before. I think, again, we'll wait to see what the acreage is. I do still think there's more downward pressure on soybeans than upward potential. Again, a lot will depend upon planting progress and again, weather during the growing season. But if we get normal production, if we get normal yields across the nation, we're going to have lots of soybeans around, both domestically and internationally. And I think that'll put some downward pressure on soybeans.
How positive are you on corn?
Corn, you know, I'm fairly neutral on corn. I think we'll be in a fairly tight trading range through the rest of spring. The key, of course, reproductive stage for corn will come a little bit later in the summer. If we do get some sparks, it'll more than likely come from that point in time. Again, the weather will dominate with the corn market.
Next week, Todd Hultman from DTN will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Nebraska's winter wheat condition took a big hit this month. According to the latest National Agricultural Statistics Service report, only 34% of the crop was rated good to excellent, 28 points lower than the beginning of March. 27% of the crop this week was rated poor to very poor. On March 20th, the Nebraska Wheat Board said signs of winter kill were evident in southwest Nebraska, with the most injured fields showing 60 to 80% damage. It also noted dryness as a concern. This week's U.S. Drought Monitor from UNL showed a sizable increase in moderate drought conditions in central Nebraska. The 22% now in moderate to severe drought is an increase of 20 points and the most since June. We traveled through southwest Nebraska this week to see those injured fields. We also talked with Nebraska Extension's Bob Klein, who said this damage is not only historic, but will also continue to impact future crops.
Well, I've got over 50 years in southwest Nebraska and west central, and I've never seen injury this bad in such a wide area. And I think we've had the biggest fluctuation on temperatures, and that was part of the damage. And then we have a lot of other things in there too.
How widespread is the damage, Bob?
Well, the worst is in southwest Nebraska and then that southeast part of the panhandle. And then, of course, it extends a little bit farther east and farther north. But the worst damage is over here in the southwest. And some of that fields won't be worth leaving.
What caused the injury?
Well, there's a number of factors. One is the dramatic changes in temperatures we had. In this particular field that we're in here in Chase County, we had warm temperatures in September, October, and then early November. In fact, on November 9th, the temperature was 78 degrees. 4 days later, on November 13th, it was a -7. Then also on December 31st, it was down to 20 below zero.
What other things led to damage in different fields?
Yeah, well, we see all kinds of injury in these. It's variety makes the difference and so forth. The tillage practices are different. If they went out and tilled the ground before planting, dried out the soil a little bit, we're seeing a lot of injury. Early planting this year really got hammered. And I think the reason that was is because we had such good growing conditions through September and October and even early November that it used up all the moisture, and then of course that dry soil was a major factor in the injury.
As you mentioned, you're in research plots near Enders, Nebraska, and we can see in those plots how much of a difference variety selection can make. You also have trials near Trenton, Nebraska, where you say that problems from the drought of 2012 are still impacting wheat. Can you explain how that is?
Yeah, we've got plots down in Hitchcock County where on October the 18th, 2012, a lot of silt blew into the north part of the field. And we actually lost our plots in the north part of the field there because of all that silt that blew in on that windstorm on October 18th of 2012.
What should farmers do, Bob, in those situations where injury and winter kill is very evident?
Well, it's a number of things. One, of course, before you do anything, you want to go in and talk to your farm service agency and discuss the problem with them, and then also talk to your crop insurance people. Then also, before you do anything, look at any herbicides you may have used on the field that maybe won't let you rotate to some of the crops that you want to. So really check all those things out before you make any decision on what's the best way to go from here.
Is there a way to first assess what kind of yields you might be looking at before you decide what to do with that field?
Yeah, we actually have a pretty good NEB guide on estimating yields, and what you do is you figure out what row spacing you have and then the number of plants you've got per foot a row. And you can look at that and it gives you a pretty good idea of what the potential is out there. Now, you kind of want to take into account that it's real early yet and wheat hasn't completely tillered, and so your accuracy is not as good as if you had tillered wheat and have those tillers to count too. And we'll probably have a few less tillers in that. That NEB guide uses 5 tillers on the average, and I would probably be using 3 or 4 this year because of the injury we've had on the wheat.
And if the farmer does decide then to abandon the crop, Bob, what are the other options they might have for planting into that ground?
We probably think in many of these areas out here, grain sorghum will be the #1 choice, or something like proso millet, or in some cases even forages. Now, if you plant some forages out though, one of the things is don't cut it real short. Keep some of that residue out there to catch the snow and to take through the fallow period and so forth. So we really need to leave some residue out in these fields to protect them from wind and water erosion.
Finally, Bob, what does this wheat damage do to the next crop that might go in for the rotation out there in southwest Nebraska?
Yeah, well, one of the big things here is having a successful winter wheat crop. If you have that good 60, 70, 80 bushel wheat residue, that really helps us reduce evaporation and also helps suppress the weeds. So we can be pretty successful with corn, grain sorghum, or other crops if we have that good wheat residue. If we don't, we really reduce our chances of being successful with the next crop. So if we go into a field that only has 30 bushel wheat because of the winter injury, our chances of having that real good corn or grain sorghum crop are greatly reduced that year. The other thing is, we normally out in this area, we start off with a good winter wheat crop. That's really the key, and then corn or grain sorghum, and then we fallow it and go back to wheat and try to get that good wheat crop again. Well, if we don't have that good wheat crop to start with, and then we won't have as good a corn or a grain sorghum crop, we don't have the residue for that fallow period, and so it really, suffering from this wheat crop in 2015 can carry over for a number of years.
Bob says if farmers decide to let wheat grow, they'll need to keep an eye on weed control, as weeds will come in easier without crop competition. On the Market Journal website, we'll link to the NEB guide Bob mentioned containing more information on assessing damage and estimating yield potential. The April Nebraska farmer says for most Nebraska producers, grain sorghum remains a forgotten crop. But this month's issue says that's changing. Huge demand from China has increased prices across the U.S. and farmers are looking to reduce costs and consider grain sorghum. You can read more about the surge in sorghum in the April Nebraska Farmer cover story. 7 states have at least one confirmed case of the H5N2 Avian Flu, counting Minnesota, Kansas, and Missouri. The virus can affect all domestic poultry, including turkeys, chickens, geese, and ducks. No human cases have been detected in the U.S. or internationally, and the USDA says poultry prepared properly, cooked to 165 degrees, will kill any avian influenza virus that could be present. Earlier this week, we asked Nebraska Extension poultry specialist Sheila Purdum to explain what the H5N2 avian flu is, how it affects birds, and how producers can implement biosecurity precautions on their operations.
It's an influenza virus just like what you or I get, but it's specific to poultry. It's actually very harmful to the birds. High mortality rates, the birds will have a loss of appetite, they'll be listless, and eventually they die from it because they have no immunity. Very contagious. It's moving from waterfowl into these flocks, and within a flock you'll have as much as 80 to 90% mortality very quickly. Biosecurity is of the utmost importance. You want to make sure that you don't have any migrating waterfowl having a water source or feed source on your farm. Likewise, if you're taking a family picnic to a state park nearby where there's been a break, you want to make sure that you don't bring home any of the waterfowl's excrement on your shoes. Disinfect everything before you go into your operation. If your birds or chicks for some reason aren't eating well, they show a high fever or temperature, and they're just starting to unfortunately die, you want to get a sample into our veterinary diagnostic lab. This particular virus doesn't care if it's a large operation or small, so even if you have 10 birds in the backyard, you want to take the same precautions. Well, unfortunately, there's no vaccine developed yet for this particular virus, so you're going to have to depopulate, disinfect, and take a time out basically in your facility before you bring in new chicks.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to information on sample submission to the Nebraska Veterinary Diagnostics Center. We also have hog market analysis this week with the University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Klein. The USDA's quarterly hogs and pigs report counted the U.S. inventory of all hogs and pigs at 65.9 million head, 7% above a year ago but down slightly from December. Nebraska's total inventory was up 2%, its breeding inventory was up 5%, and its market inventory was up 1%. Friday, after this taping, the USDA was scheduled to release export numbers for February. We already know January was a bad month for shipments, as pork exports during the first month of 2015 were down 21% from the previous year. Lower market prices are threatening margins now for pig producers who enjoyed historic profits in 2014. But the charge for pork in the grocery store could also be falling. We talked with Ron Wednesday afternoon and began by asking for his thoughts on the March quarterly hogs and pigs report.
Few more market hogs than we expected. That's going to be bearish news for hog prices for the next 5 or 6 months. But the good news was farrowing intentions came in smaller, lower than expected, and so that gives us some hope for prices late this year and early 2016.
What kind of light does it shed on impacts of PEDV?
Well, the pigs per litter were up 6.2% during December, January, February compared to a year ago. That means PED death loss was just a small fraction of what we had a year ago. We were down 5.5% in pigs per litter in the winter of 13-14 and up 6% this year. So hopefully we'll continue to see those good numbers, and PED death losses will be a lot less than they were that first year we had it.
Any estimates in there that were indicative one way or the other of herd expansion?
Well, yes. winter fairings, December, January, February, up 2.4%. That wasn't really surprising. We made a lot of money in the hog business last year with record high hog prices, but spring fairings up only 2.1%. And the big shock to me was summer fairings down 1.1%. We're losing money in the hog business, but normally producers don't respond this quickly. But right now it looks like fewer sows will farrow this summer than last summer, and like I said, that gives us some optimism for hog prices late this year and early next year.
Yeah, tell me where market prices are right now, Ron.
Well, carcass prices around $55 per hundredweight on live weight basis, 43 at the tops on down into the upper 30s at the terminal markets. We should see that improve seasonally. Hog prices tend to rally as we move from the first day of spring into early summer.
For the unfamiliar viewer, tell us where that stands compared to where that market used to be.
Well, hog prices the last several weeks have been half, actually a little bit less than half of where they were a year ago. So it's a whole different year profit-wise this year compared to 2014.
And can you go a little bit further on what that means for margins as we go through 2015?
Well, farm prices always move first, and then grocery store prices follow. We had a real sharp drop-off at the farm level. Grocery store prices are down a bit, but not a whole lot, and that leaves the margins between the farm gate and the consumer quite wide. In fact, record wide right now.
What do you expect for those meat prices in the grocery store?
Well, they should continue to decline. Hog prices aren't going to bounce a whole lot real soon, we don't think, and there's usually a month or two lag, so you should get a better buy in pork in grocery store meat case this month than last month, and probably a little bit better buy come May than what you're going to see for prices this month.
So a few weeks ago I had emailed you to double check the export numbers from January because they were down so much, and you said yes, that's accurate. What do you expect when we see those numbers later this week on February?
They're not probably going to be any better, Jeff. The dollar strengthened even more from January to February. We continue to have problems with moving pork out of the West Coast docks because of labor dispute. That's going to start getting better here in April and May, but the February numbers on trade, we're going to be down a lot again, we're afraid.
So is that a significant threat to overall demand?
Well, yes, it is. We export 20% of the pork we produce, and when you're looking at 20% drop in exports year over year, that means a lot more pork has to be moved through the U.S. market, and you move that product, but you move it at a much lower price.
The next inventory report is slated for release the last Friday of June. The next look at meat prices will come Friday, April 17th. Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, the big news was the thunderstorm activity that developed on Wednesday evening and carried on through the overnight hours into Thursday morning across eastern Nebraska. That line of thunderstorms developed all the way from the Arrowhead region of Minnesota back southwestward toward north central Kansas, and as it progressed toward the east, it was able to at least get into some moderate moisture, and we did see that line of thunderstorms drop in the area of 1 to 1.5 inches just north of Interstate 80 and south of Interstate 80 in east central and southeast Nebraska, and along the I-80 corridor from essentially just west of York to Omaha. We were looking at close to 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, but once you get to Grand Island and westward, of course, the precipitation totals dropped off rather dramatically. One area of the state that we really need to see the moisture. And then, of course, the second system that came through, which was the upper air low, moved through Thursday night into Friday, and we've seen a mixture of rain and a few flakes of snow across portions of southwest, west central Nebraska. Precipitation totals were not that impressive, essentially in the 1/10 to 1/4 inch range for many locations, though it's not great moisture, it was at least some moisture. Now as we go forward in time, it does look like at least we'll start the holiday weekend on a dry note, and then we'll be turning our attention as the trough moves into the western United States that might shoot a little pieces of energy out into the central plains and touch off widely scattered thunderstorm activity as we get into the midweek period, and then we'll look for some type of a small cool down as we end the next week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we have in store. Of course, the system that was responsible for our inclement weather has now moved off into the eastern United States, and we have ridging aloft, so we're looking for a really nice day today. We'll be looking at 70s across the southwest, south central, As we get up closer to the brunt of the cold air that remains over the northern plains, we're looking at a little bit cooler conditions in the northeast. Upper 50s, low 60s looks to be in order. Now as we go into tomorrow, what we're going to notice that trough starts to dig into the western United States, and that's going to shift our flow in the upper atmosphere from the southwest to the northeast. And it's also going to allow a little bit of moisture to move up into the central and southern plains. It doesn't at this time appear to be any thunderstorm development during the day, but there might be an isolated thunderstorm that might touch off in south central, southeast Nebraska during the overnight hours of Sunday, but even that is less than a 20% chance. As we get into Monday, this trough starts to make more progress toward the northern plains, and we might see some scattered thunderstorm development across the panhandle and portions of northern Nebraska during the afternoon hours, maximum heating, but again, we're looking at 10 to 20%. But more importantly, as we get into the day Tuesday, that trough really starts to dig. We're going to have much better feed of moisture, and what's going to be some very warm conditions moving into the region. We could be looking at mid-70s across a good portion of south central and eastern Nebraska, with cooler conditions moving into the northwestern part of the state. But more importantly, it looks like we see some thunderstorm development during the late afternoon hours across the high plains region, and then some of that will start to progress eastward during the overnight hours, such that by the time we get to Wednesday, you'll see the main brunt of the energy sitting right just to the south of Nebraska. Looks like our best opportunity for moisture. Again, the eastern half of the state's looking at anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch with this system. The western part of the state, 1/10 to 1/4 of an inch looks to be common. By the time we get to Thursday, the system departs toward our northeast. We get a little bit of cool down, about 5 to 10 degrees, and a much more broader cool down as we get into Friday, as we start to see a little bit cooler air coming in. But yet again, there's another system to our west that we'll pay attention to as early as next weekend. Temperature forecast, fairly mild for the next 4 days across the state. Then we start to see a cool down midweek with a chance of thunderstorms, heaviest precipitation during the Tuesday night to Wednesday time period. As we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast next week, the following Tuesday, above normal temperatures return. And in terms of precipitation, below normal precipitation with that system coming out, this might be overplayed in terms of moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, wheat damage in southwest Nebraska, the USDA's quarterly hogs and pigs report, and the H5N2 Avian Flu. As always, you can follow us during the week on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Todd Holtman will analyze grain markets, and Bryce Anderson will give us an outlook of spring planting weather. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
No matter how you look at it, animal agriculture helps Nebraska's economy. The livestock industry provides increased tax revenues for schools and community services. Livestock enterprises also create jobs while contributing to existing businesses such as local banks and grocery stores. A thriving livestock industry helps maintain our current way of life, but also provides opportunities for the next generation of farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff helps to raise awareness of the importance of animal agriculture to Nebraska.